Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel on the merge. My name is Christine Kim, and here to discuss Ethereum's historic transition to proof-of-stake are three extremely knowledgeable guests. I have with me Matt Cutler, the CEO and co-founder of Blocknative, a blockchain infrastructure company that specializes in mempool data extraction. We also have Park Feierbach, a protocol research manager at Figment, an institutional staking service provider. And last but not least, we're also joined by Bert Miller, product lead at Flashbots, which is a research and development organization focused on mitigating the negative impacts of MEV, something that I'm sure you guys have all heard a lot about from the prior presentation. So thank you so much, Matt, Park, Bert, for being on this panel. Let's get started with first how the merge went. I think it came as a surprise to many people just how smoothly the upgrade went. But now that we're 1 week in, Matt, what are we seeing on the network? What kind of data are we getting around the metrics of how the network is faring? Anything particularly interesting you saw with mempool activity or anything through the Blocknative MEV relay that you've been seeing that you can share with us?
Sure. So the merge happened about as smoothly as it possibly could have happened. Myself and many others were anticipating at least a few bumps and weird things along the way, and to everybody's relief, it went about as smoothly as it could have. Literally, you could submit a transaction to the public mempool on the last proof of work block, and then it would have gone through and confirmed on the first proof of stake block without interruption, which is an incredible achievement by everybody who was involved. Underneath the covers, of course, of the merge were many serious upgrades to the network, including the emergence of PBS and block building. And that market has formed up and is operating today. Right now, 33% of all blocks are being sourced from block builders, which is pretty amazing. And the dynamics of that are out and exposed. And there's dashboards that we can talk about that reveal that. And one of the things that we have seen, it would appear to be a growth in the amount of transactions circulating in the mempool. But that hasn't had any adverse effect on the state of the network, on gas prices or things like that. We're not entirely sure why that's the case, but it doesn't seem to be anything that's by any means abnormal for the network. And so it's like, hey, the merge is behind us. Here's the next day of the rest of our lives, and we're excited about that.
The next day of the rest of our lives. I really do want to dive deep into block building a little bit more on this panel. But before we get to that, let's dive a little bit more on the data that we're seeing in the network. Park, what are validator staking operations looking like post-merge? Do you have any data for us about the returns that validators are getting? Any metrics that you're seeing about how validators are faring now that the transition has happened?
Yeah, I think broadly, it went very smoothly, right? And so our expected kind of benefits from running MEV boost operations, which went live about an hour after the rest of the merge went through, we got to see that it was an effective and the correct choice to make. So we're seeing a lot of positive outcomes from having adopted the builder model that early on. And so I think what's most interesting in the longer term here is going to be seeing just all the different options that pop up on the market across all the different building alternatives and choices that are going to continue to develop across the market. Right now, we use Flashbots, MEV Boost, which is great. And we're very excited to see that because of how young this market is, it's going to continue to create a lot of amazing alternatives that people approach. And yeah.
I think the last time I checked, around 81% of MEV boost blocks are being generated by the Flashbots relay right now. That's a major, it's a big metric, I must say. And there are 6 other different relays that are also operating on the on Ethereum right now outside of the Flashbots relay. We've got Blocknatives, we've got Edens, Manifolds, Blocks routes. Bert, I'd love to know, what's your take on why Flashbots is dominating right now? And do you expect that dominance of the Flashbots MEV relay to wane over time?
So I think it is extremely early days for this market. We've literally seen an entire new industry of block building and relaying come up in the last week. These entities did not really exist before, at least not in the way that they did prior. And so I think Matt earlier gave me a great analogy that this is the beginning of a marathon, and you shouldn't evaluate a marathon by where we are at the very beginning, right? So Flashbots right now does have a very privileged position. We are relaying the greatest number of blocks on the network. It's something like 80% of blocks that are relayed by MEV-Boost, which is a subset of 30% of all blocks, are relayed by the Flashbots relay. And I think 80% of that number, still yet, is from the Flashbots builder, too. But again, this is very early days for the market. We expect over time for there to be more competition, both from relays and builders, as more participants bring up their infrastructure, more participants learn about block building, more participants start to improve, see the network. And I think the dominance of the Flashbots builder in particular has already come down as new block builders are starting to submit not just to their own relays, but to other relays as well. So I fully expect those numbers to go down over time. And I think the reason why they started the way that they do is that the MEV-Boost abstraction has a lot of trust assumptions in it. Validators in particular need to trust relays to act not maliciously and also to have very performant infrastructure. And we've developed great relationships with teams like Figment, with other teams that are running validators. And so we're very happy that they have put their trust in us, and we're going to do our best to make that worthwhile. But we expect that trust to develop between validators and other relays going into the future as well.
Yeah, I think that component of trust is a really interesting topic right now, especially now that we're in a proof of stake world. And one of the things that you had mentioned was evaluating between different relays. We've already seen certain relays that have bugs in them that need to be fixed. And I'm curious to know, I mean, Park, when you were evaluating between the different relays, how easy, how transparent was the data around how a relay that should function, like what does that look like? What are some of the things that I should be watching out for? What are the pros and the advantages of one relay over another? How do you evaluate between those different relays?
I think we're maybe not necessarily, we've been paying attention to Flashbots for a very long time. And it made sense to see that the source of the choices across all different relayers would be where we would start, is go with the experts first. So in terms of evaluation, I think the evaluation still is something that has to happen. It's not something that's happened, right? And so to assume that we can go through and evaluate whether or not other relayers are competitive, we're not quite at that stage as much as we would like to be. And so I think that's, as Bert said, right, we're a week into this. So I have no doubt, and we are actually in the course of doing a lot more analysis that will eventually bring us to that point where we can make these decisions. But from the outset, going with where it is that we have the most knowledge and the most knowledge share is kind of what informed our choice.
Matt, anything you would add to the future around competition between relays and the evaluation of different relays from the perspective of staking providers? I think one of the things you had mentioned in our earlier conversation that was really interesting was around how sometimes that decision on which infrastructure to use to earn MEV is really concentrated in the decision in the hands of few people.
Yeah, so a couple of things is one, it's really important to emphasize how early we are in this whole journey. And most of what we're all doing is just make sure it works. Do the various systems talk to each other? Are they doing what we expect? Are we able to fulfill on the promises that we have? And as an infrastructure operator, so Blocknative operates massive amounts of global real-time infrastructure. The last thing we want to do is reach out to someone like Park, who's making an adoption decision for a fairly large number of validators, and not be ready for that conversation, because you only get really one shot at that. If you fall down, if your infrastructure isn't able to fulfill on what it said it's going to do, then you have a lot of work to recover from that. So again, I think the market is just forming up that's out there. But we actually see a lot of opportunity for differentiation at this layer, to have different classes of relayers that make different assumptions, that have different levels of operational stability, different levels of performance, that will then result in different levels of outcome in terms of the blocks that get produced. And so I think we're at the very beginning of all of this. And we, Blocknative, as a provider in this category, see just a huge design space that is just beginning to be explored. And we're excited about what's to come.
I want to talk a little. I totally agree with you that this is very early stages, and we talked a little bit about how the design space for the relay competition in the future could play out. But I also want to talk about how the design space for the competition around block builders could play out. There's quite a lot of concern that there is this naturally centralizing force around block building. And Rob, I want to know from your perspective, what are the strengths and the resources that are needed to become a successful node operator versus a block builder? And how does that competition between the two differ?
Node operator, as in just someone that has like an Ethereum.
Like a validator versus a block builder.
Yeah. So we have deliberately designed MEV Boost such that these are extremely different roles. We've designed MEV Boost such that a validator can, off of the shelf, run software and receive the most profitable block. And it's supposed to be as simple as possible. Hopefully someday you can be running a validator on your phone and contributing to the overall security of the Ethereum network. So we're trying to minimize the amount of resources and infrastructure and expertise that you need in order to be a validator on one hand. On the other hand, block building is something that has economies of scale first, and it requires a lot of specialization in the technical infrastructure that you have, as well as your knowledge. And so off the top of my head, you need to be very good at doing simulation. So understanding exactly what an Ethereum transaction does, or bundles of transactions, sorting those, merging them into the most profitable combination. Oftentimes, you need to be handling extremely high loads, too, especially when there's MEV on the network. We can see thousands of bundles in a single second, and we need to simulate all of those in a super performant way. And we're starting to see, and hopefully this isn't the way that things go, but we're starting to see that you need kind of high-touch relationships also, both with users to send you their transaction flow, or maybe dApps and wallets as well.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about exclusive transaction order flow and how that might change the dynamics around block building competition. Are you concerned at all, Matt, about the potential for more transaction order flow to be circumvented from the mempool to private channels, to very competitive block builders? Do you think that there's a natural tendency or a natural force that will help mitigate some of the impacts around the growth and the popularity of exclusive transaction order flow?
So one of the big concerns about this whole category is that it will lead to proprietary order flow or pay for order flow, and you'll start to see sort of structures that exist in the traditional financial markets be reflected in the Web3 markets, and nobody wants that. We all want an open and competitive marketplace. At the same time, there's no restrictions on this. There's no rules that say that you can or cannot do that. So our expectation is that design space is being opened up. I think a lot of players in the ecosystem are waking up to the reality of MEV and how it affects various participants. And I think a lot of players who have historically been passive in this game are very interested in becoming active players. As a result, everything's going to be experimented with. You're going to see certain folks, you're already seeing certain protocols, certain builders have certain tie-ups where they're creating some proprietary situations, and that's to be expected. I think the opportunity for us as an ecosystem is to create systems that incent for more open, more public, more generalized behaviors. And quite frankly, there's a lot of opportunity to do interesting things there. At the end of the day, it's the race is beginning, the new games are being played, and we should expect all avenues to be explored.
Speaking of the race, I find that sometimes there's two different narratives being pushed by Ethereum core developers and then from the Flashbots team, with Ethereum core developers explaining and trying to advocate, validators there should really be more independent validator node operators than there are people that choose to run MEV Boost, people that choose to participate in a staking pool. There's this narrative of, in order to protect the decentralization of Ethereum, the choice is up to the community, and there has to be a certain amount of altruism going on. Park, do you get that sense? Do you feel sometimes when you're thinking about how to run your validators of choosing profitable options like running MEV Boost, but then also getting this other narrative around safety and around making sure that your validators are contributing to the decentralization of the Ethereum ecosystem? Tell me a little bit about your thoughts around that conversation.
Yeah, I think what's kind of maybe the right approach to think about this is like it's something we keep saying over like throughout this panel, which is that it's very early. And so like it makes sense for the people who are best at doing something to be the people who will maintain it at the beginning, right? And so I think as it stands right now, as we kind of like look at the network, this narrative of decentralization is something that we need to continuously move toward. And so while we do have like some centralization in any element of a stack that comes to a protocol, as long as you are continuously moving towards this narrative where it becomes easier to run nodes, you can run a node on your phone. As long as we continuously aspire to that and act with altruism toward that goal, like we will eventually get there, and it will result in, while there are larger operations that can be can be much more profitable, there will be eventually a lot more optionality available to people to take part in operations that are at a smaller scale.
Gotcha.
And I think there were a bunch of embedded assumptions as a part of what you said there. So first, that the Ethereum core dev community as a whole has kind of a homogenous view, and I don't think that's at all true. So there are lots of opinions within the Ethereum core dev community. Some of them are more positive, and some of them are more negative on MEV-Boost. But MEV-Boost as a system in the broader proposer-builder separation abstraction from day one has been developed in collaboration with the Ethereum core dev community. And I think there's a whole diversity of viewpoints there. So I wouldn't paint it just as like there's one perspective over here and there's another perspective there. I think the second thing I want to note is that Flashbots wants to build systems that work under assumptions of rationality and not honesty. Mm-hmm. And we think that that is the best way to create long-term, healthy, incentive-aligned networks. And that's what we have in mind with MEV-Boost as well. The third thing I want to point out is that I don't think you at all have to choose between altruism and safety. I think you can have both. MEV-Boost is a system, and the Flashbots relay delivered something like 50,000 payloads on testnets. It's been reviewed by many different core devs. It's been reviewed by many different security experts. And we're up and running and delivered 10K blocks without a single missed slot or a single moment of downtime on mainnet today. So I think you can have both security, altruism, and long-term incentive alignment.
I'm glad you chimed in, Bert, because I mean, were you surprised that only roughly like 20%, like 1/5, was running MEV-Boost at the start of the network? And I think it's now up to 1/3. You had mentioned before this panel, but do you think that as more people start to trust in that software, that number will get closer to, say, 100%?
Absolutely. I think I would be surprised if we hit 100%. It's very difficult. Even in proof of work days, we had about 90% at the peak of miners that were running MEV-Geth, which is the equivalent of MEV-Boost in proof of work. To be honest, I expected the adoption of MEV-Boost to be less than it is now at this point. So my internal prediction was about half of what it is right now. And the reason is that the merge, as it is, without MEV-Boost involved, is extremely complicated. It was a complex event, and node operators already have a lot to care about, as I'm sure you know. And we had a couple people express to us, like, hey, we care about this. We're testing it, but we need to make sure that the merge goes well, and that's our #1 priority.
Right.
We'll come and we'll have a conversation with you afterwards, and we'll run MEV-Boost after the merge goes well. And this is absolutely what we've seen happen. So the day of the merge, we had about 5% of validators that are registered at the Flashbots relay. Within, I think, a few hours, that jumped to 8%. And within a week, we're at 33% today. So adoption has actually exceeded my expectations. And I think we'll get to somewhere around 80 to 90%, at the limit. I don't know, within a quarter or two would be my guess.
And the whole thing to realize is this model of proposer-builder separation has economic incentives which encourage folks to adopt this model, because if you're a validator and you're operating under this regime, you'll actually have higher rates of return. And so there's this whole dawning realization on everyone that 1, the system works, awesome, that 2, MEV-Boost model is more profitable, and 3, I think most folks, including Park and Figment, start with the originator, which is Flashbots, and then say, oh, okay, now we can expand out, we can open the aperture. Exactly. And so it's a very classic adoption wave, and we at Blocknative, we operate a relay that we call Dreamboat. We started with like less than 0.1% of all validators accepting MEV-Boost supporting our relay, And now we're like, I don't know, 30-40% of all of the total pie. So it's moving really quickly, and I mean, it's sort of shocking how fast it's moving, given that we're 7 days post-merge. But it's also just really incredible to see a lot of theory and a lot of ideas and a lot of predictions play out in real time.
Yeah.
And we're going from the idea and imagination of block building to the reality of block building. And those of us who are participating would say it's even more interesting than we hoped it would be.
And we are super happy at Flashbots to see a healthy, global, diverse ecosystem of relays and builders as well. In the proof of work system, the barriers to entry were pretty high. There was a single builder per relay. We designed MEV-Boost to be as open as possible, encourage as much competition from relays and builders as possible. And I'm thrilled to see people like Blocknative run both builders and relays. And I think it's a testament to the kind of game that we designed in this.
I love to see this camaraderie on stage. This is very, very good to see. I think we've talked a little bit about block building competition. We've talked a little bit about relay competition. I also want to touch on a pretty big elephant in the room, and that is regulation, now that Ethereum is a proof-of-stake blockchain. And the day of Ethereum's merge, the Securities and Exchange Commissioner, Gary Gensler, had said that cryptocurrencies and intermediaries that allow holders to stake their coins might pass the Howey test and be deemed as securities. Now, he didn't explicitly call out Ethereum or say which cryptocurrencies, but his statement does matter now more than ever because Ethereum is a fully proof-of-stake blockchain. Park, from your point of view, especially from the standpoint of working with risk-averse institutions, how are institutions thinking about the regulatory risk of ETH now that it's a proof-of-stake, now that it's generated by a proof-of-stake blockchain, and also the risk of intermediaries like, say, Lido, staking providers, especially ones that are issuing liquid staking derivative tokens?
So first I'll say very carefully. We're thinking very carefully about it. But the second thing I'll say is like the language is not settled, so I probably can't talk about it too much.
Say that one more time.
Probably can't speak to it too much.
Gotcha. Well, there is another regulatory matter that I want to press in on. Actually, before that, anything else that Bert or Matt you want to add to that conversation?
I would just say, with the merge, Ethereum positions itself to be the foundation of the next economy, and we need regulatory clarity, right? Like, there's no one in our ecosystem who's saying we don't want to be regulated. We're just saying we need clarity on these issues, and it's often a little depressing to sort of see these axes get swung around very subtle issues. And Howey test has been around since 1930, and maybe we need to evolve some of the thinking to reflect the reality of what we have today. And there are members of the current administration and members of some of the regulators which are advocating for a more progressive and modern POV, but it's TBD if those voices are going to win out. We certainly hope that we don't see regulation by enforcement, because that's dangerous for everybody involved. It's bad for the ecosystem. I think part of the reason why you're seeing positivity across the panel is because what's happening is net constructive for the ecosystem. It's helping grow, having more people participate, having more optionality, more programmability, more expressivity. Uncertain regulation does the opposite. It just freezes everybody because no one wants to screw up. So we're hopeful that enlightened regulation will come.
I think also it's intriguing to sort of consider that it seems a broader narrative across the market is that regulators are uninformed on our industry. And I think that's probably a lot more inaccurate than people realize. Like they think that regulation or like commentary on regulation is issued with a lack of awareness of what's going on. And that's not necessarily true. I kind of like, the way I think about it is it's more likely it's like a river around a rock. They're trying to see what it is that the market will do to maintain itself with the narrative that it's seeking with the highest level of altruism available, so that when something like a sense of regulation comes in, it's coming from a perspective of like, oh, well, all the work has been done to make sure that this is as good for people as possible, instead of like having negative incentives built into it, having potential for negative structures being built within it. So I think a lot of the times the narrative tends to sort of lean within our industry toward the idea that they're uninformed. And I don't think it's necessarily that true.
I think that's an interesting point, especially given around how not all of the conversation we're having around we need regulatory clarity is around statements that Gary Gensler, the Securities Exchange Commission, have talked about, especially on the day of the merge, but also about regulatory enforcement actions that have been taken in recent months. And I'm talking specifically about the US Treasury sanctioning smart contract address Tornado Cash, which has, if you want to know more about that, I'm going to give a shameless plug for Galaxy's research report on it, which you can find at galaxy.com. But this wider conversation around the censorship resistance of Ethereum, and if regulators are very in the know about the way that Ethereum functions as a proof-of-stake blockchain, could it be that they'll ask or they'll require staking providers, staking pools to censor transactions in accordance to US sanctions? And Flashbots in particular has come under quite a lot of heat because it's widely known and has been widely known that Flashbots is an entity that operates a relay that censors transactions. If, Bert, it was clear that the operation of Flashbots block builder, Flashbots relay, was harming the credible neutrality of Ethereum and the censorship resistance of Ethereum, do you think that Flashbots would stop operations? Do you think that they would basically halt their products?
I think if we thought that Flashbots was a negative for Ethereum, its users, and the crypto ecosystem as a whole, then Flashbots wouldn't exist anymore. Full stop. If you want to hear a little bit more on that, like I think it's complicated and multifaceted, right? So today, Flashbots is the dominant block builder or the dominant relay, right? But I think MEV-Boost as an abstraction requires both honest and competitive participants in order for the most value to be delivered both by users and validators. And it makes sense that Flashbots is a participant in this game, even in the abstract, given the censorship of the Flashbots builder and the relay, because you need a backstop to the market to make it competitive. And you need parties that set good standards for how participants within the ecosystem should operate, e.g. in making our data transparent. So if the Flashbots builder was not out there bidding what we do for blocks, that would mean that a builder could come in, undercut, pay a very low value to in their blocks and capture the rest of the value of that block themselves. And this benefits literally no one except for the specialized entity that is a builder. So I think today our participation in the overall ecosystem is good. I think it is required for the abstraction of MEV-Boost to make sense. And we continuously, every day, ask ourselves if we are a net good for the crypto ecosystem. And the day that we think that that answer is no is, I think, the day that Flashbots won't exist.
It's worth stating that, like, these are not monolithic entities. Like, we're organizations full of really smart, really motivated, really opinionated people. And as soon as any of these organizations take action which are not aligned with the values of the individuals who make it up, they just leave. And so, you know, as leaders of these organizations, you have a much less discretion than you might expect because of the strength of the value of the ecosystem, which is great. And we fiercely debate what's the right thing to do, what do we have to do, what's going to be best for the ecosystem. And then, you know, the opposite of that's also true. When you're well aligned, then people get super motivated.
Yep.
And you get really constructive activity for the entire network. So ultimately, I think the system is working and working well.
Matt, any color you can give on because Dreamboat is a relay on Ethereum, and it's a relay that is not censoring transactions. What has been your guys' rationale behind that? Tell me a little bit about the regulatory clarity that you guys are still seeking around that and how you think that's going to play out.
So we as Blocknative try to produce as credibly neutral infrastructure as is possible, and our infrastructure actually powers a lot of other builders who are doing interesting things on the ecosystem. And yet we're a US-based corporation, where US jurisdiction applies to us, and we're in active conversation with various legal advisors about what we need to be doing. And our position will continue to evolve as we try to figure out what the right way to navigate things are. And the worst part is when you get stuck between a rock and a hard place and you have what you want to do for the credible neutrality of the network and what the regulations would seem to apply. So our position continues to evolve, and we're respectful of the positions of everybody else in the ecosystem who are trying to do the right thing by them and their users.
So now that the merge is done and Ethereum is in a fully proof-of-stake blockchain, this has been an upgrade several years in the making. For my final question for all three of you guys here in the last couple minutes of our panel is talking about what's next. What's next on Ethereum? What are we most looking forward to in terms of now that developers have gone through this upgrade? I think there's a lot of focus on Shanghai, what's going into Shanghai, but also multi-year efforts like dank sharding, proposer-builder separation. These are lots of kind of buzzwords that are probably people are going to start to hear about a lot more now that the merge is over. But I'd love your guys' takes on what you guys are watching and what you think is the next biggest item on Ethereum's roadmap, because there's quite a lot still left to be done. Park, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think for Ethereum itself, the greatest thing is that there is a loose roadmap, and it is loosely being followed. I mean, I think probably loosely isn't the wrong term to use there. But what's really amazing is, like, having said this a bunch of times throughout this panel, is like we are at the beginning of like quite an amazing journey. And I think what we see most effectively happening within the Ethereum core dev community is an adaptation to paradigms. And I think that's the most compelling part to me about this ecosystem in particular, is that there is a continuous desire to adapt to paradigms as they change and plan for them, rather than being, ossified in a roadmap and sticking to that until you launch it, and then realizing that that's not actually what the market wants. So as far as what's in the future, you have all of the buzzwords and all of the options, and it's going to be very interesting to watch people move toward them, because I do think that the initial layer of transactions and financialization for exchange is just the bottom part of whatever Ethereum can represent. And so what comes next is greenfield.
So all of the above. Bert, very quickly, what do you think is?
So I'm paying attention to EIP 4488, which is data blobs on Ethereum. This will then scale L2s, and I think it'll actually have very interesting follow-on effects for MEV, for rollups, longer conversation. I'm also very excited about all the conversations around builder decentralization and creating a decentralized builder, which is the Flashbots mission. And those are the two things I'm paying attention to.
Matt?
I would just say that the merge, while a technical achievement, is also a tremendous social achievement.
Yes.
And we've really set up the conditions for the coordination communication across the entire ecosystem to really build on this moving forward. And so we're just getting started. I think we'll look back at the merge sort of like we look back at the iPhone when it was first launched. Like, it's pretty primitive compared to the iPhone that we enjoy today. But if you squint, you can sort of see where we are. That ultimately what's to come on the network is just vastly more power, vastly more flexibility, vast more possibility, and the work of folks here, the works of folks out in the ecosystem are making that all possible, and we're thrilled to be a part of it.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, Park, Bert, for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around and watching this panel on the merge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.